All right. Hello, everyone. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation, in conjunction with our friends at the MIT Press, I would like to welcome you to Autotheory, Encounters, Embodiments, Critique. This is a day-long inquiry exploring the unique literary and artistic practice that builds upon traditions that have fused life writing, philosophical encounter, embodied theorizing, and cultural critique. Autotheory constructs new practices of critical theory, transgressing generic boundaries and bridging stylistic registers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge at the outset that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. Numerous dialects were spoken along this peninsula. I would like to take this moment in an offering of respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Today's event is being moderated by Brostoff and Vilashini Cooppan, with in participation of Laura Cernat, Chris Kraus, Erica Richardson, and Elda Maria Roman. Our forum utilizes as its inspiration the newly published book titled Autotheories, which is, of course, edited by Brostoff and Vilashini Cooppan and is published by the MIT Press. Our event will be organized into 4 sections, each with a 10-minute break in between. Our first session will serve as an introductory exploration. It is titled Two Critics in Search of a Form, and it will feature Brostoff and Vilashini Cooppan and poses the question, what is autotheory? Where did it come from? And how did it find us? They will be discussing their new edited volume, Autotheories, and introduce the critical form of the moment. Brostoff is assistant professor of English at Kenyon College and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Edinburgh, and interdisciplinary scholar and translator. Their work converges at the crossroads of literary and critical theory and trans and queer cultural production. They are the author of the book Unruly Relations, a critical reframing of autotheory from Columbia University Press, and are also the co-editor of Reassignments, Trans and Sex, from the Clinical to the Critical from Fordham University Press. Their scholarship and translations have appeared in Representations, Critical Times, Synthesis, and South Atlantic Quarterly, amongst other outlets. Vilashini Cooppan is professor of literature and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz. She is the author of Worlds Within, National Narratives and Global Connections in Postcolonial Writing from Stanford University Press. She has also authored numerous articles and book chapters on comparative and world literature, postcolonial studies, memory studies, the theory of the novel, critical theory, and much more. Her work appears in numerous journals, which include Simploc, Gramma, a journal of theory, comparative literature studies, public culture, Qui Parle, amongst others. Her work has also appeared in the edited volumes Loss, The Politics of Mourning, Postcolonial Studies and Beyond, Trauma, Memory, and Narrative in Contemporary South African Novel, and of course, the MLA Guide to Teaching World Literature, amongst others. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Brostoff and Vilashini Cooppan. Welcome to City Lights. It is such an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Peter. We're truly thrilled to be here. We want to thank the City Lights Foundation for inviting us to be here today. It's really a thrill to introduce Autotheories and Autotheory in both the singular and the plural, which we'll be talking about shortly. We're also so grateful to the MIT Press, to our editor, Victoria Hindley, our publicist, David Olson, and to our special guests who will be joining us in our future sessions today, including Laura Cernat, Erica Richardson, Elda Maria Roman, and Chris Kraus. So I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. Oop. Peter, it's saying that screen sharing is not turned on. Oh, now it is. All right. All right. Can folks see my screen okay? Thumbs up if yes. Vilashini, you can see the screen, yes?
I can see it just fine. Thank you.
Okay, fabulous. Okay. So as Peter mentioned, this is our first session. We're going to be chatting for about 40 minutes about two critics in search of a form. Those two critics are us. So we'll begin.
So, refracted many times over in various degrees of clarity and opacity, this is the question everyone asks us. When we say we've been working on auto theory, everyone from our moms to our colleagues to our lovers to our friends to the person next to us on the plane or at the bar says, "What is that?" Sometimes there's an expletive before that. Sometimes their eyes glaze over and you realize your date is over before it began. Even now, 5 years later, after beginning this project, it's hard for us to give one definitive answer to the question because auto theory is many things.
And because auto theory is many things, we thought we would just start with a little reading of the cover of our new volume, Auto Theories. So first and foremost, the plural, you can tell already. So we wanted to call the book Auto Theories in order to underscore that auto theory is not a monolith. It is many things, and we will be talking today about those many things that it is. So just as auto theories is plural, we also understand the self that auto theory spotlights to likewise be plural, right? So we're super interested in the ways in which auto theories as a practice underscores the plurality of both the field, right, and the self that is in part its subject. So what you see here on the book cover is the kind of refracted multiplicity of auto theories that becomes fragmented. It visualizes an understanding of what auto theories are and what auto theories do. So in other words, it's a self that acknowledges its own constitution as being ever-shifting, multiple, intersectional, and an assemblage. And we see this being visualized also with our names being fragmented and repeated, multiplied by that shifting notion of an assembled self. So I'm sure you want more of an actual definition. So we're going to start by offering you the definition that appears in the very opening of the introduction to our volume. So we could hypothetically start by saying that auto theory is a practice that combines autobiographical elements with theory, philosophy, and literary and cultural criticism. Auto theory is language play, body talk, technologies of the self, utterances of an I, intersections of identifications, declarations of desire, theoretical constellations. However, that's only how it begins.
So let's think both about what auto theory isn't and then about what auto theory is. People often conceive auto theory, and the term has really blasted into a kind of hyper-visual presence over the course of the last decade. We might take as one starting point the publication in 2015 of Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, though we want to complicate that story, and we do in the volume, and we will here today. But auto theory, first of all, is not autobiography, a genre as old as the Confessions, whether Augustine or Rousseau, a genre that even as it tells the story of a life is also riddled with gaps and silences. Auto theory is also not autofiction, a term that was popularized in the 1970s to describe writing that was marked not by characters and plot so much as by a first-person protagonist, contiguous with the writer themselves, and a close chronicling of everyday details of the writer's life. Those of you who have made it through Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle, and I think very few people have, will recognize this sense of the quotidian personal quality of autofiction. Autofiction is also not memoir. Memoir has another incredibly popular genre over the period, I would say, of the last 2.5 decades. Memoir has conventions that auto theory shatters, a cohesive self, changing and evolving over time. Auto theory is not a linear story of becoming. It's not a Bildungsroman, the story of a growth. It's not the portrait of the artist as young anyone. Auto theory also is not narcissistic navel gazing. The simple centering of the self above all else, a kind of turning inward at the expense of looking outward. Auto theory, we think, is not navel gazing, but the umbilical tethering of the self in all its consistencies to everything that is outside the self. Auto theory links an I to you, to we, to words, to worlds. We call auto theory a practice of relation, meaning both this tethering of an I to what is not the I, and also the relational act, relating, telling, word spinning.
So in that sense, if you were to ask auto theory what its pronouns are, auto theory might respond in the register of we, us, our, rather than I. So when we say that auto theory is relational, what we mean is that auto theory is a form fixated on laying bare what it means to be in relation to other people. So it's not about a self narrating itself or narrating its experience, but rather it's about analyzing those structures that have produced what it means to be a self. In other words, auto theory asks, what and who has made me? What and who are the conditions of this writing? What and who am I thinking with? And what and who am I thinking against? So just to offer an example along those lines, in Testo Junkie, Paul Preciado writes, quote, I'm not interested in my emotions so much as their being mine, belonging only uniquely to me. I'm not interested in their individual aspects, only in how they are traversed by what isn't mine. So in other words, it's not about the self um, that the self that produces experience on the page, but rather the social structures that have produced the experience of selfhood.
So, one way I often think about this is that auto theory is made through kin or kinship and also through skin or skinship. Kinship is, of course, a whole web of affiliations, the kind of community of people or things or texts or world experiences that bring us into common with one another. When I think about auto theory as skin, I'm also evoking exactly what Alex has been talking about, the ways in which we can think about the self as being bounded by its skin. What is within me is me, and what is outside that barrier is everything that is not. And yet the skin, of course, is a membrane. It's porous, it's tactile, it's a meeting zone and a contact zone. When I say auto theory is a skin contact sport, I mean that it's precisely something that resituates the abstract things that we might call theory, or indeed the things that are not us, and situates them in close proximity to the practices that we call the self. Auto theory's texts are easy to dismiss as simple confessionals, often sex diaries or bodily histories or pseudo memoirs, but the graphic element, what I'm calling the skinned quality of auto theory, I think is part of its particular charge and what allows it to serve as a meeting point. Um, Sarah Ahmed, the feminist critic, says theory is more powerful the closer it gets to the skin. I think we believe that.
We absolutely do. So just to summarize, in terms of what we're thinking about what auto theory is, we're thinking about the ways in which it tethers the self to the social, tethers word to world. In this sense, thinking about the very relationships that produce an I and condition its ability to write. Like Vilashini has explained, right? Theory does more the closer it gets to the skin, in Sarah Ahmed's words. Um, in this sense, auto theory's method of citation shows us that it is always genre hybrid, always genre shattering. And in the words of poet Kazim Ali, always genre queer, right? It's thinking about the ways in which genre, multiple genres, enable us to patchwork together relationships between the subject and the social, words and worlds.
So this is a slide about our loves. When I say that auto theory is kin, it's about the text one draws skin close as a kind of both armor and second skin for moving through the world. There's a primal scene rather, in auto theory. And the scene goes something like this. I read X, and then I realized I could write differently. The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which so often figures as the American origin story of auto theory from 2015, in fact contains another primal scene within it. Nelson discusses reading Roland Barthes' discussion of the classical ship the Argo in his book Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes from 1975, and references the Argo as the ship that is taken apart piece by piece from every port that it goes to, so that all that remains of the form is the name. The linguistic naming of this thing, much like the linguistic practice of the self, is what ensures whatever might be some continuity. Maggie Nelson also confesses on the first page of that text, I flat out stole the term auto theory from Paul Preciado. So here again, there's another primal scene contained within a primal scene, pertained within a primal scene. Paul Preciado, in his Testo Bianchi, is also mourning another friend and writer on the eve of his passing. Auto theory is constructed, I would say, as a series of Russian dolls. But the point is not to get to the center of this Tootsie Pop.
So when we say that auto theory is relational, right, what we mean is that it has a certain grammar of conjugation to it. So in the introduction to our volume, we talk about the ways in which auto theory conjugates. So you might imagine the conjugation going something like this. I read, I write. I read you, I write me. This produces a we. So the primal scene that Vilashini is narrating is scenes of readers reading readers. And this creates a kind of citational circuit that forms auto theory's aesthetics. So each of the primal scenes that we've had in our relationships to auto theory showcase this circuit, this network of readers reading readers. So it was too hard to choose just one book each for us to explain our own kind of moment of I read X and I realized I could write differently. So if you had to ask either of us to choose one, we'd have to give you everything.
So auto theory was many things. It was Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts.
It was Roland Barthes' A Lover's Discourse.
It was Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks.
It was Christina Sharp's In the Wake.
It was Saija Hartman's Lose Your Mother.
It was Paul Preciado's Testo Junkie.
It was Anne Cvikovich's Depression, A Public Feeling.
It was Emma Lieber's The Writing Cure.
It was Eve Kosofsky-Cedric's A Dialogue on Love.
It was Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein above the village of Chamonix performing transgender rage.
It was Alison Bechdel's Are You My Mother?
We'll stop here for now, but we want to take a second to invite you all to drop in the chat other texts that have been part of your own primal scenes. So other auto-theoretical texts that you've read in which you had that moment of realizing that you too could write differently. So please take a minute and drop in the chat any texts that have been a part of your own auto-theoretical primal scene.
Thank you. You can think of it as shedding a little skin in the chat, the parts that you carry around yourself.
So now we're going to break it down a little bit. we've been talking about what is auto theory, but actually the term is a neologism. And it's also a compound, right? So we're gonna take a moment, we're gonna break it down. We'll start with what is the auto in auto theory. So we've already begun by saying the auto in an auto theory is plural, it's multiple, it's fragmented, it's a refraction, it's an assemblage. But I want to talk a little bit about etymology, because what Vilashini and I are doing is actually defining auto theory against its own etymology. So when you hear the word auto, right, the prefix, the Latinate root would suggest a self, right? A self by oneself, individual, independent, autonomous, singular, etc. But on the contrary, as we've kind of already expounded, we're looking at the ways in which auto theory actually disrupts this very etymological idea of an individual, autonomous, singular self. And that's in part because we understand auto theory as theorizing the ways in which the self is produced by and in relation to others.
So another way we might understand the auto in auto theory as something that is both itself and something else, not itself. And thirdly, something that is mediated by yet another thing. We're not imagining the auto and auto theory as a pre-existent given self that lives in a little box and can simply be downloaded through communication through the form of an auto-theoretical writing. It sort of raised the question, are you getting the self? Are you having access to it? Are you in some kind of direct communication with it? And I think something gets in the way. That thing is language. Uh, both the auto and the theory, the two of them skin close, as I've said, are skin close to yet another thing, language. Roland Barthes in A Lover's Discourse says, language is a skin. I rub my language against the other. It is as if I had words instead of fingers, or fingers at the tip of my words. Sometimes there's friction between the language and the self. Sometimes there's friction between the auto and the theory. But as language becomes the medium through which these thoughts and practices, both about self and about, for a moment, let's call theory, the working abstractions through which we understand the self's place in the world and the possibility of that place changing. As we think about this relationship between auto and theory and auto theory and language, we come across this idea of the productive friction, the tension, the rub. Sometimes in this period of thinking through the relationships between these terms, you want to pay attention to the seams and the sutures, not to what we think of as the whole.
So Vilashini is actually using the phrase seams and sutures as a citation. And it comes from Susan Stryker's extraordinary performance, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, above the village of Chamonix, performing Transgender Rage. And in that performance, in the introduction to it, she writes about those seams and sutures. She writes, quote, I wanted the formal structure of the work. And here, let me actually say a little bit about the formal structure of the work. So this is a performance piece that really splices genre in the ways in which we see with auto theory. So it begins with a monologue. The monologue becomes criticism. Criticism gives way into a journal entry that breaks into verse. And the piece ends with theory. So the four sections of this performance, right, are a means of like citationally speaking back to Victor Frankenstein in the voice of the monster as as a metaphor for the transsexual subject. So Stryker writes, quote, I wanted the formal structure of the work to express a transgender aesthetic by replicating our abrupt, often jarring transitions between genders. challenging generic classification with the forms of my words, just as my transsexuality challenges the conventions of legitimate gender, and my performance in the conference room challenged the boundaries of acceptable academic discourse. So, to go back to the seams and sutures, one of the things that Stryker's performance, like many autotheoretical texts, does is to illustrate, right, through form, right, the ways that auto and theory collide and collude in producing a self that is always already mediated by language. So in this particular case, the challenge of auto theory's transgender aesthetic is to produce in form what trans folks experience in transition. So in this case, Stryker is really illustrating how the auto and the theory, right? How the seams and the sutures of the auto and the theory produce a means of narrating the world that has produced a self.
So now we want to think, having just lingered on the auto in auto theory, about the theory in auto theory. As our previous comments have suggested, there's no definition of the many definitions of auto theory that does not in some way encompass the self and interrogate the self. But it's also true that if we hone in on that self supposedly within auto theory's embrace, there's no practice of that self that is intact. There's no practice of the self that is not always bursting its own boundaries, leaching beyond itself, living through the skin contact of that particular membrane, some kind of inescapable relationality of self with what is not self. And that's that inescapable relationality as precisely a mode of relation that hangs together or constellates so many of the texts that we think of when we think of auto theory. They are texts that relate relation. If we pause now to think a little bit about what the theory is in auto theory, we'll have to hazard another definition. Theory, I would say, is a term that we use for describing, sometimes abstractly and sometimes not, how we make sense of structures, forms, the very conditions within which we exist. Each of these structures or forms or frameworks is one that situates an individual and a group in relationship to the structure. It could be cis heteropatriarchy. It could be racism and colonialism. It could be planetary catastrophe. It could be the age of information saturation and virtual identity. It could be the body and its many meanings. It could be the work of capital. Theory is a dialogue that we undertake with the world. It's not something we use as something we create in concert. And we undertake this dialogue with theory, I think, in the hopes not just of making sense of it, but of changing it, to paraphrase Marx.
I was just going to try and surface the Marx there. So, auto theory is always citing its theoretical text. So in this case, Vilashini is citing the moment when Marx says, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." So with change in mind, we want to offer some more specific examples of like what kinds of theory we see in auto theory. Right? So what we mean by the theory in auto theory is many different things. So for example, on the one hand, we could be thinking about post-structuralism's investigation of the self in and as language. And we could also be thinking about a parallel and interlocking tradition of BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, people of color, CRIP, neurodivergent, working class, feminist, queer, and trans writers seizing a collective voice through the register of the I. So these are theories that come from marginalization, from structures of power, from axes of oppression, and from the violences of power that produce a self. The auto theories of our book are anti-colonial ones. They are feminist auto theories, queer, trans, crip, and differently abled auto theories. They are auto theories that wrestle with and hope to change the very conditions of their own existence.
So now we wanted to take a sub-question. It wouldn't be a discussion of auto theory if we didn't get a little confessional. What is our relationship to auto theory? I'll tell you about mine. In graduate school, I sometimes felt like the goose, with theory being stuffed down my throat. It's too much to swallow, and it doesn't always do your insides good. Some of it is a delight and a luxury, but some of it is simply an overload. Bell Hooks says she came to theory because she was hurting. The hurt is the sense that this language of theory is something that excludes you, that wasn't made for you. It's a secret code that you can't crack. It's something that puts you on the outside looking in. And some of the theory I read in graduate school absolutely left me feeling this way, rejected, confused, self-doubting, undone with anxiety. And some of the theory I read left me differently undone, broke open, shattered in my assumptions, changed in my sense of what I believed might be possible to think, to do, to dream, to write. Some of it was the theory that remade and continues to remake me. I don't think of theory as dry. I think of it as wet. It made me hot. It was a language whose mysteries I wanted to penetrate, whose words I wanted to whisper intimately, and to try to ventriloquize myself on the page. I wanted to live by these words. I liked that theory trickles in rivulets that feed into rivers and go down and back from the sea of language. I liked that sometimes you could stay in one stream and that other times you could simply swim in the deep.
I love this water metaphor, and admittedly, I did swim competitively in college, but to be frank, theory is the hardest thing I've ever had to learn to swim in. And that's a funny thing for me to say as a comparatist. So both Vilashini and I are trained in the field of comparative literature. For me, being a comparatist means that everything I do and study is transnational and transdisciplinary by design. However, that also means that I am always between languages, between cultures, between genres, and yes, between genders. Theory was a language I had to learn in order to move between these worlds. It was the connective tissue that would enable me to think transnationally, to think transdisciplinarily. And I'm always code switching, switching between registers, switching between languages, switching between places, switching between genres, which is one of auto theory's symptomatic traces, right? To be moving between. But theory has been a study in language for me, a study in language acquisition. It has its own lexicon for not only understanding and critiquing power, but reimagining how it might be redistributed. Auto theory has taught me to speak the language of power from outside of it.
Mhm.
Oh, that's my cue to change the slide. But actually, I'm gonna skip forward since Vilashini, do you want to do this one or the next one?
Um, I think I'll do this one. I love the second one as well. The second one is Roland Barthes talking about what it means to write and how it is one constructs oneself in fragments. Actually, I will show that just for a second after. This is friends. Okay, so Roland,
Which one?
Fanon and then Barthes for a
Okay.
second. In Frantz Fanon's incendiary, incandescent mid-century anatomy of racism and colonialism, Black Skin, White Mass, this is how the central chapter, the lived experience of the Black man, begins. It's a chapter that has a different voice, a first-person voice, in fact, from the rest of the book, and it's one that I think for me at least, is a thread, a genealogical thread in the history of auto theory. Fanon describes this protagonist, this first person protagonist with many coincidences with his own being, as someone anxious to discover the meaning of things, but only to find I am an object among other objects. And the line before this is, of course, the interpolation which he receives on the streets of Paris, look, a Negro. In this suffocating reification, he says, I appealed to the other. I hoped I would recur and return to this lightness of being. I hoped, having been taken out of the world, the other might put me back in the world, but I stumble. All I find is the other fixing me with his gaze, his gestures, his attitude. I lose my temper. I demand an explanation. I explode. Here, he says, are the fragments put together by another me. This passage reminds us, as if it's written in fire, of the structuring conditions that we've just described, the frameworks imposed upon and against which selves have to make themselves. And as Fanon resists the ocular centrism, the typing and fixing and freezing of colonialism and racism's visual economy, he also finds that under the pressure of that gaze, he falls apart. And the task of this chapter of Black Skin, White Mass is to reassemble those fragments, not into some kind of coherent whole, but into something whose pieces again testify to the shattering force of racist violence, and secondly, to the possibility of jigsawing, assembling, composing something that will constitute a resistant subjectivity for a free future. I have never forgotten this passage. I am never without it.
So we have so many more passages that we'd like to share with you from Gloria Ansaldúa and from Roland Barthes, but in the interest of giving you all an opportunity to engage in the conversation, I'm going to move us forward, and we invite you in the Q&A, if you want us to loop back to talk about Ansaldúa or Barthes, please ask us. We are so ready to talk ad nauseum about our many autotheoretical attachments. So as we get closer to wrapping things up, we want to ask, and we've already covered this to some extent, we want to talk a little bit about where auto theory came from. And this is a subject that we'll also take up with Laura Cernat, in our next session. But to ask where did auto theory come from, right, seems to implicitly imply that there's an origin story here. And I have a problem. We have a bit of a problem with origin stories. And it's for the following reasons. To ask where did auto theory come from seems to suggest that there is a kind of monolithic narrative that could pinpoint where and when something started, that could perhaps draw a straight line from point A to point B that begins then and brings us to now. Of course, this is a kind of progress narrative, right? That is inextricable from notions of singular inheritance and what has been called by Chimamanda Adichie the dangers of a single story. It's been interesting for us to witness auto theory's popularization in the US over the past decade, in the sense that it tends to get retroactively attributed to a few critically acclaimed texts. In other words, there's an emergent canon of auto theory. However, that canon is always effacing other moments and other movements that we might understand auto theory to have emerged from. Again, this brings us back to the reason we've called the book Autotheories, right? We want to stress the plurality of the multiple places and peoples and communities that auto theory has come from, right? So rather than canonizing, periodizing, taxonomizing, we're interested in thinking about the multiple possible places, the plural assemblages, the transnational and transdisciplinary histories that have given rise to auto theory and its many corollary forms. Of course, this reminds me, and I'll open a very brief bracket just on the subject of canonization, because in our fourth session, we'll be talking to Chris Kraus, the editor of Semiotext and creator of the Native Agents series. Kate Zambrino's book, Heroines, has this moment that I love very much, where she talks about how the word canon actually comes from a Greek root that means measuring stick. And it's in this moment where she talks about how processes of canonization are a kind of big dick contest, right? And we want to push back against the kind of emergent canon that we're seeing as auto theory is increasingly popularized and circulated, to instead stress its multiple interlocking genealogies that range across time, across place, across languages, across nations and cultures.
Right. So these are some of the many theoretical threads or genealogies that might be said to be the multiple origin stories of auto theory. We, as Alex has said, we can think about the emphasis upon linguistic mediation of the self and post-structuralism, the ongoing project and fissures and divisions and unknowings and desires of the psychoanalytic subject, the way in which queer women of color feminisms was seeking to articulate community in the very voicing of an oppositional identity that was understood to be intersectional in terms of the many frameworks pushing within it. And we could go on and on about decolonial critique, about a kind of environmental or eco-turn. We'd love to discuss more of the various places within which the auto-theoretical is being taken up as something that can do something.
So again, this is moving us from the question of what auto theory is to what auto theory does, right? And we're interested in thinking about what auto theory does as a relational practice, what auto theory does socially, and what auto theory does politically. So just to wrap things up, the million-dollar question, right? So moving on from what is auto theory to what does auto theory do, we'll conclude by asking why auto theory and why now?
So this is a playful form, but it's not just for playing. It combines experimental rigor with rigorous experiments. And those aren't just experiments on the page, they're experiments in imagining differently, how we as eyes might occupy and intersect with and make common cause and build sort of affiliative webs with others and with worlds. It seems important, so important to say this right now when we're asking of everything but can it help? This is a moment of despair, and indeed, much auto theory comes from despair, from grief, from loss. It also comes from rage. It comes from abjection. It comes from desire. It comes from doing battle with your demons. It comes from making peace with your past. It comes from narrating what has gripped you and beginning to let go. And in that letting go, finding and imagining another future lived in concert with others.
So in other words, we need auto theory now because as form, we need tools that enable us to reckon and to wrestle with the intersecting crises of the present. This is a subject that we'll take up in far more detail in session 3, and we hope you'll join us. That session is called Politics, Communities, Solidarities. So just to offer a couple concluding thoughts, if you're interested in learning more beyond what Vilashini and I have just shared, we invite you to read the full book. The QR code on the screen will take you to order the book. You can use the code READMIT20 for 20% off through Penguin Random House. I feel like a caricature of myself offering this. but in a less caricature-ish way. We hope you'll join us. Those of you who are local to the Bay Area, we hope you'll join us to celebrate the launch of the book in person at City Lights Bookstore on Tuesday, March 4th at 7 p.m. However, for today, for the more immediate future, we hope you'll stay tuned. We have 3 more sessions. Session 2 with Laura Cernat, Auto Theories Then and Now. Session 3 with Erica Richardson and Elda Maria Roman, Politics, Communities, Solidarities. And Session 4 with Chris Kraus, Making Auto Theories, Presses, Publishers, Popularization. So for now, without further ado, we want to turn it over to you all and ask what questions you have for us or comments you'd like to share with each other. As we've said several times over the past 40 minutes, we understand auto theory as a relational practice. So we hope that with the end of each session, we can put that into practice in conversation with all of you. So Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And actually, we can see one of the questions.
Okay, if you would like to, it's fine. I mean, why don't I start with the one that I have in front of me so we can get it rolling, and I think more are going to be coming in. So Shay says, wondering if Alex and Vilashini might speak to relationships between auto theory studies and affect theory studies, given some of the definitional overlaps and tensions, social. Thanks for this exciting text and presentation.
Thank you. Well, just to talk for a second about these 2 fields, about auto theory, which we've just sketched, and affect theory. Many of the writers we are invoking here, particularly Eve Sedgwick, are crucial voices in the study of the affects, or loosely speaking, the emotions, kind of floods of sensation that are both proper to a self, but also constitute a kind of connective tissue, linking the self to others, to particular moments, to events or acts or gatherings, and to experiences. And I think one of the things that for me links how we think about affects, which are, remember Paul Preciado saying, I'm not interested in my own emotions as if there's something proper to me. I'm interested in the ways in which they, my emotions or my affects, are traversed by what is not mine. So Preciado is using the language of emotion or affect there, but is also resituating it in something that we might say sort of renders it no longer the property of a self. In the same way that we are thinking, and auto theory is thinking, about identity as not the property of a self. It's not something you have, it's something you do, as Judith Butler has taught us to think. So I would say that's one of the possible distinctions there. And there's so much more to be said. The only other thing is maybe if we think about Eve Sedgwick and the work on affect theory, one of the things she says in the context of queer theory is that queer is also not exactly an identity, but a practice. Queer is troubling. It is relational. It is strange. It is coming at the world slantwise. So it's not something necessarily you are, but a thing that you do in a way that, in fact, you approach everything.
Alyssa says, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. The concepts critique, quote unquote, and composition, quote unquote, have both arisen in this conversation. If we define critique as, quote, seeing through, unquote, discourse, and composition as gathering, quote unquote, discourse together, I'm curious how you see these 2 impulses at work in auto theory, and especially if and how you think they might produce different kinds of seams and sutures.
Thank you so much for this great question, Alyssa. I'm so glad that you asked about composition, because I think we could certainly talk more about form. And we're going to be talking in person on Tuesday night at City Lights quite a bit about form. But I love how you've offered composition as gathering here, because I think one of the things that auto theory's citational politics does is to gather other voices together in the very space of the page, right? So one thing that's super interesting to me from an etymological standpoint is that the very word citation contains a kind of summoning or conjuring within it, right? So what auto theory does when it cites other theory is to conjure those voices, conjure those others, summon them into the space of the page in the service of critique, right? Or in the service of thinking with. That's part of auto theory's relational grammar, is to summon those others that have made possible the writing and the thinking that transpires. Um, we've talked about auto theory as assemblage, and I really like this idea of composition as a kind of gathering space, right? How we gather together those voices, those theories, those literary texts that have enabled a thinking of the self that is multiple, that is fragmented, that is a pluralized assemblage.
Vilashini, did you have anything to say as well?
I think Alex has done a fantastic job with that answer. Thank you. And I guess one thing I would add, having just thought so much about the assemblage, the suturing, the making of a Frankensteinian body, and here we might think again of Susan Stryker's foundational My Words to Victor Frankenstein, but also Paul Preciado's writing on the monster or monstrousness of the trans body. But I'm interested in Alyssa, in how you frame critique as seeing through discourse. And I want to push back a little bit on that, because I think that critique is not always about the, shall we say, sort of pincering, the holding of this thing that we penetrate through language or discourse, or the abstraction, right, of some kind of formulation to get the thing itself. I think theory is both the concept and the mediation of that concept through discourse, right? So I'm a deep post-structuralist, so I'm not sure that we ever see through discourse. It is in fact the thing we see with, and then we take it apart. But there's no real beyond the discourse, or beyond, let us say, better, beyond language. And that is actually a concept that is in productive tension with what so many people think about auto theory, which is its resolute bodiliness, right? Its fleshy quality, its attention to the graphic, meaning the explicit as well as the written. And I think many of us working in this field are trying to figure out just precisely how auto theory can be both a thing of the word and a thing of the flesh. And this is something that Alex himself is really working on in working through this concept, a foundational concept in queer women of color theory of theory in the flesh. So more on that later.
Yeah. So we have more questions coming through, but we do find ourselves approaching the top of the hour. So I think folks join us for some of the other sessions, and also for the final panel, which is going to give us a lot of space to be able to go back and forth and actually engage. Really want to thank you both for joining us, and moreover for all your efforts in making today's forum a reality. It means so much to us here at City Lights. Also want to thank David Olson of the MIT Press and Jen Ramage of Random House for their invaluable help with the proverbial nuts and bolts of making books available and facilitating with various things. So it means a great deal. Thank you for helping. We're going to be taking a short break now. Our next session will be at 12:15 Pacific time, 3:15 Eastern time. It is called Auto Theories Then and Now. You may use the same Zoom link to access that session, and we hope to see you there. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events are publishing program, our educational outreach are all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So we're going to be closing this room in just a moment. We hope to see you shortly.